This audiobook is brought to you by the Paladin Learn History app. There is a name that has meant terror for 800 years, not the abstract terror of a distant catastrophe that happened to other people in other places and other centuries, the specific, immediate, bone-deep terror of hoofbeats on a horizon that was clear yesterday and today is not, the terror of smoke rising from a direction where a city used to be, the terror of a messenger arriving with news that the thing everyone said could not happen was already happening, and it was closer than anyone had imagined, and there was nothing left to do but run or stay and face what was coming. The name is Genghis Khan, and tonight we are going to try to find the person underneath it. Not the legend, not the conqueror whose empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the doorstep of Europe, the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. Not the figure of nightmare that Persian poets wrote about and Chinese historians recorded in language that still carries the shock of someone describing something they cannot quite believe they survived. Not the destroyer of cities, the killer of millions, the name that made entire populations abandon their homes and flee before he ever arrived. Not the monster, the man, because there was a man. Before there was an empire, before there was a title, before there was a name that made cities surrender without a fight simply because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate, there was a boy, born on a steppe that went on forever in every direction, born into a world of almost incomprehensible harshness where survival from one season to the next was not guaranteed, and where the forces that shaped a person had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with circumstance. That boy became Genghis Khan through a process that is, when you look at it closely and honestly, one of the most remarkable and most disturbing transformations in the history of human ambition. The transformation did not begin in a moment of glory. It did not begin on a battlefield or at a moment of political triumph. It began in a moment of loss so complete and so foundational that everything that came after it can be understood, at least in part, as a response. Come with me to the steppe. Come with me to the beginning. The Mongol steppe in the 12th century was not a place that human beings had tamed. It was a place that human beings had learned to survive in, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference mattered every single day. The landscape was vast in a way that defeats description if you have not stood inside it. Grass from horizon to horizon, interrupted by rivers and rocky outcroppings, and the occasional forest climbing a hillside before giving way again to open ground. Baking in summer under a sky so large it felt like a physical presence pressing down on you. Locked in ice in winter with winds that came from distances so great they arrived carrying the cold of places no one in the steppe had ever seen or named. There were no cities. There were no permanent settlements of any significance. There were camps, the round felt-covered jers that could be assembled and disassembled in hours, because the fundamental logic of steppe life was movement. You followed the grass, you followed the water, you moved your animals to where the grazing was, and you moved yourself with them. And if you stopped moving for too long in any one place, you died, because the steppe did not sustain people who stood still. The animals were everything. Horses were wealth and transport and military power simultaneously. Cattle and sheep were food and clothing and the raw material of the ger. The entire economy of the steppe was organized around the management of these animals, and the entire social structure was organized around the competition for the resources those animals required. Grazing land, water access, the routes between summer and winter pasture that generations of movement had established and that competing clans contested with the same seriousness that settled peoples contested the ownership of farmland. The Mongol tribes that inhabited this landscape were not a unified people. They were a collection of clans and confederacies in a state of more or less continuous conflict with each other, raiding and counter-raiding, stealing horses and animals and people, forming alliances that lasted until someone found it advantageous to break them, and breaking alliances with the same ruthless pragmatism with which they had been made. There was no law beyond the power of the clan. There was no authority beyond the strength of the chief. There was no safety beyond the loyalty of the people around you, and loyalty on the steppe was a conditional thing, tied to success and to the ability to provide, and withdrawn when those conditions ceased to be met. This was the world into which Temujin was born, not the name history knows him by. That came later, along with everything else. In the beginning he was simply Temujin, born sometime around 1162 to a minor clan chief named Yasuge and his wife Hoelun. The circumstances of his birth were already complicated before he drew his first breath. Hoelun was not Yasuge's first choice of wife in any romantic sense. She had been abducted from another man during a raid, the standard method of acquiring a wife in steppe society, and brought to Yasuge's camp to become his companion. The man she had been taken from was a Merkit tribesman named Chiledu, and he remembered it. On the steppe, where grievances were held across generations and repaid with interest when the opportunity arose, this memory would eventually matter in ways that would reach directly into the life of the child Hoelun was now carrying. He was born, according to the secret history of the Mongols, the remarkable document that is the closest thing to a primary source from within his own culture, clutching a blood clot in his right fist. The secret history treats this as a sign of his exceptional destiny. What we can say with more confidence is that the boy who emerged into the cold air of the steppe that day was entering a world that would demand everything from him before it gave him anything, and that would give him nothing freely that it could make him take by force. Yasuge was a capable man by the standards of the world he inhabited. He had followers. He had enough reputation and enough connections to negotiate meaningfully with neighboring clans. He was bold enough to lead successful raids. He was ambitious enough to form alliances with more powerful confederacies and to position his family for advancement in the brutal hierarchy of steppe politics. He was the kind of man that other men on the steppe respected, which meant that he was the kind of man that other men on the steppe also feared and envied and watched for weakness. The weakness that killed him came from an unexpected direction. Temujin was 9 years old when his father died. Yasuge had been traveling with his son to negotiate a marriage arrangement, the betrothal of Temujin to a girl from a neighboring clan named Borte, an alliance that would link families and strengthen the position of both households in the complicated social web of the steppe. On the way home from delivering Temujin to Borte's family, Yasuge stopped to share food and drink with a group of Tatars he encountered on the road. The Tatars were one of his people's primary enemies. Whether they recognized him or simply took the opportunity that the hospitality convention of the steppe had created, they poisoned him. He made it back to camp before he died, but only barely, and by the time Temujin had been retrieved from Borte's family and brought home, his father was already beyond reach. The clan departed. This is the fact that everything else flows from. The followers who had attached themselves to Yasuge because he was a successful and capable provider had no reason by the logic of the steppe world to remain loyal to his widow and children. Loyalty on the steppe followed power, and a dead man had no power, and his 9-year-old son had less. The calculation was cold and it was quick. Within a short time of Yasuge's death, the clan had moved on, taking their animals and their jurs and their futures with them, leaving Hoelun and her children behind with almost nothing. Almost nothing on the 12th century Mongol steppe was very close to nothing. Let us stay with this moment longer than the narrative usually stays with it, because the abandonment of Hoelun and her children is not simply background to the story of Genghis Khan. It is the story of Genghis Khan in the way that the original wound is the story of the person who carries it forward through everything that follows. Hoelun was left with 5 children and a stepdaughter, and whatever scraps of food and equipment had been considered too insignificant for the departing clan to bother taking. On the steppe, in any season, this was a desperate situation. In winter, it was a death sentence for most families. Hoelun was not most people. The secret history describes what she did in the years that followed with a kind of awed precision that suggests the person recording it had difficulty believing it even as they wrote it down. She fed her children with wild plants and roots and whatever small animals could be caught. She held the family together through winters that should have killed them. She moved between the demands of survival and the demands of raising children who needed to understand not just how to find food, but how to think about the world they were living in, what it required, and what it would take from them if they let it. She was fierce. Not in a sentimental way, fiercely practical, fiercely clear-eyed about the nature of the world and the conditions of survival within it. She transmitted this clarity to her children through the specific method by which mothers who have survived impossible things transmit that survival to the next generation, which is not through instruction, but through example, through the daily demonstration of what it looks like to face a situation that should be hopeless and refuse to accept it as hopeless. Temujin watched this, he learned it, and he carried it forward into everything he subsequently did. But the abandonment itself, the specific act of a community deciding that its obligations to Holan and her children were less important than its own interests and comfort, that he also carried forward. He carried it in a different way. He carried it as knowledge, the deepest and most foundational kind of knowledge, about what people would do when the cost of loyalty exceeded the benefit, about the gap between the obligations people declared and the obligations they honored when honoring them became genuinely difficult. This knowledge shaped everything. Every alliance he ever made, every reward he ever gave, every punishment he ever imposed, every decision about who to trust and how far, was filtered through this foundational understanding that loyalty was conditional and that the conditions needed to be managed with precision and enforced without exception. The boy on the steppe absorbing the lesson of the clan's departure was becoming, without knowing it, the architect of a system designed to make that departure impossible to repeat. A system in which loyalty was so thoroughly incentivized and betrayal so thoroughly punished that the calculation that had made the clan's abandonment rational would never again produce that result. He spent the rest of his life building that system. The empire was the system, at its largest scale. But it began here, with a 9-year-old boy watching the backs of the people who were supposed to stay. The years of hardship produced other lessons alongside the foundational one. There was a half-brother named Borte, older than Temujin, from a different mother, occupying an ambiguous position in the family hierarchy that became less ambiguous and more contested as food grew scarce and the question of who had the right to which resources became a matter of survival rather than convention. Borte was taking food, taking game that Temujin and his younger brother Khwarazmian had caught, asserting a priority over resources that the family could not afford to have asserted. Temujin and Khwarazmian shot him with arrows. He was perhaps 12 or 13 years old when he made this decision. The secret history records the killing without extensive commentary, which itself tells you something about the world in which the recording was made. What the killing tells us about Temujin is harder to state cleanly because it is genuinely ambiguous. There is a survival logic to it. Borte's behavior was threatening the family's chances in conditions where the margin between survival and death was already paper thin. Removing that threat through the most direct available means was, within the logic of the steppe world, a defensible response. There is also something else visible in it. The willingness to act decisively and without hesitation on a judgment that most people, even in that world, would have struggled to act on. The capacity to do the thing that needed to be done, as Temujin understood what needed to be done, without being paralyzed by the weight of what it meant or the impossibility of taking it back. This capacity would show up again, at much larger scale, in situations where the weight of what it meant was measured not in a single life, but in thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives. The capacity was the same, the scale was different, and the scale changed the moral nature of what the capacity produced, even if the capacity itself remained consistent. Then there was the captivity. The Taichud clan, rivals of his father, raided his family's camp and took Temujin prisoner. He was fitted with a kangwe, a wooden device that immobilized the neck and arms and made independent movement nearly impossible, and he was kept in conditions designed to humiliate as much as to contain. He was passed between families in the clan, displayed as a kind of trophy made to do menial labor in the household of whoever was currently responsible for him. He escaped. He hid in a river to avoid the search parties that went looking for him after his disappearance. He received help from a man named Shira, who hid him and eventually helped him get away, taking a significant personal risk to do so. He made his way back to his family through landscape that was trying to kill him through cold and hunger and simple distance, and he arrived back having survived something that was designed to be unsurvivable. What he brought back from the captivity was added to what he had already accumulated. The knowledge of what it felt like to be completely in someone else's power, to be treated not as a person with claims on the world, but as an object to be displayed and used, to have your dignity removed by people who were doing it deliberately as a statement about the relationship between your position and theirs. He did not forget this. He filed it alongside everything else, all the experiences of powerlessness and betrayal and survival, and he continued the process of becoming something that the people who had put him in the Kangoo would eventually find very difficult to be comfortable about. He was perhaps 15 or 16 when he went to claim Borte, the girl his father had betrothed him to during that final journey. The marriage alliance that Yasuge had negotiated still held, because Borte's father, De Sechen, was a man who kept his commitments, and Temujin arrived at his camp to find the arrangement remembered and honored. Borte would become one of the most important facts of Temujin's existence, not in the simplified romantic sense that later legend sometimes tries to impose on their relationship, but in the practical and deeply human sense of a partnership forged between two people who faced extraordinary circumstances together across many decades and who shaped each other's understanding of what was possible in ways that are difficult to trace precisely but impossible to ignore when you look at the overall shape of what he built. She was not simply a wife in the conventional sense of that word, as applied to powerful men of her era. She was a counselor. The sources that mention her directly, including The Secret History, consistently depict a woman whose intelligence was real and whose political instincts were sharp, and who was not simply a passive presence in the life of the man who became the world conqueror, but an active participant in the decisions and the management that made the world conqueror possible. She was also kidnapped. The Merkid tribe that had its own historical grievance rooted in the abduction of Holun a generation earlier came in the night and took Borte, while Temujin and his family scattered to survive the raid. She was held by the Merkid for several months. What happened to her during that time is recorded in the sources with a combination of implication and omission that tells you that the people recording it found it difficult to address directly. She was returned eventually, pregnant, and the child she was carrying would be Temujin's eldest son, Jochi, whose paternity would remain a source of tension and uncertainty for the rest of his life. Temujin retrieved her by doing something that represented a significant escalation of his capabilities and his ambitions. He called in obligations. He went to his most important ally, Togrul of the Karaite tribe, a powerful confederacy that had a relationship with Yasuge going back years, and to Jamuka, a childhood blood brother whose own position on the steppe was strong. Together they assembled a force substantial enough to attack the Merkid, and the attack succeeded. The retrieval of Borte was important for several reasons beyond the personal. It demonstrated that Temujin could mobilize resources and coordinate military action at a scale that his previous position would not have suggested was available to him. It demonstrated that the alliances he had been building had substance, and it demonstrated, in a way that people on the steppe understood very clearly, that attacking what belonged to Temujin came with consequences. The Merkid would not forget this lesson. Neither would anyone else who was paying attention to the trajectory of the young man who had come up from nothing and who seemed, in the way that a few people in every generation seem, to be operating with an internal compass that was pointing in a direction nobody else could quite see. The building of the Confederation that would eventually become the Mongol Empire was not a project that unfolded according to a plan. It was a process, messy and violent, and marked by reverses as well as advances, that took the better part of 2 decades from Temujin's emergence as a significant figure on the steppe to the Great Assembly of 1206, where he was acclaimed Genghis Khan. Those 2 decades were a series of wars, alliances, betrayals, counter-betrayals, military campaigns, political maneuvers, and personal crises that would have destroyed most people who attempted to navigate them. What allowed Temujin to navigate them was a combination of factors that operated simultaneously and that are difficult to rank in terms of their relative importance. His military ability was real and exceptional. He understood the geometry of steppe warfare with an intuitive clarity that allowed him to see opportunities and vulnerabilities that his opponents missed. He was bold in the way that effective military commanders are bold, which is not the reckless boldness of someone who does not understand the risks, but the calculated boldness of someone who has assessed the risks accurately and determined that the potential gain justifies accepting them. He led from the front. He shared the physical conditions of his men rather than commanding from a position of comfort and distance. This was not simply theatre, though it had theatrical effects on the loyalty and morale of the people around him. It was genuinely who he was. His political intelligence was equally exceptional. He understood, at a level that few of his contemporaries grasped, that the fundamental problem of steppe politics was the problem of trust. The clan system created loyalties that were intense but narrow, limited to blood relationships and to the personal following of an individual chief. These loyalties were durable within their scope, but fragile at their edges, constantly vulnerable to the calculation that a different alliance or a different patron would provide better returns than the current one. He attacked this problem directly, with a solution that was radical in the context of the steppe world. He reorganized his followers not by clan affiliation, but by decimal units of military and administrative organization, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each with a commander appointed on the basis of demonstrated ability and personal loyalty to Temujin, regardless of their clan of origin. This reorganization had two effects that were both significant. It broke up the existing clan loyalties that might have competed with loyalty to him personally, distributing people from the same clan into different units where their primary relationships would be with people from other backgrounds, and it created a new form of loyalty to the unit and to its commander, that was grounded in shared experience and mutual dependence rather than in blood. He rewarded faithfulness with a consistency and a generosity that was unusual on the steppe. People who had been with him during the difficult years, who had stayed when staying meant sharing the hardship rather than benefiting from success, were remembered and rewarded when success came. This was not simply gratitude in the sentimental sense. It was a policy, deliberately maintained, because he understood that the most powerful incentive for future loyalty was the visible demonstration that past loyalty had been honored. He punished betrayal with a completeness that was equally deliberate and equally consistent. When an enemy surrendered, the terms of the surrender depended heavily on whether they had fought with honor or had committed what he considered true betrayal, breaking an oath or switching sides or killing under the protection of hospitality. Enemies who had simply fought against him and been defeated could often find a place in his growing organization. People who had violated the specific obligations he considered most fundamental faced consequences designed to be permanent and comprehensive. This system worked. On the steppe, where trust was the rarest and most valuable resource, a man whose behavior was predictable and whose word meant something was a man worth following. And Temujin's behavior was predictable. Within his own framework, within the values that his experience had produced in him, he was extraordinarily consistent. By 1206, this consistency and these qualities had produced something that had never existed before in the history of the Mongol world. A unified confederation of the steppe tribes, organized around a single figure whose authority was genuine rather than nominal, whose military force was real and capable and disciplined in ways that steppe armies had not previously been disciplined. At the great assembly on the banks of the Onon River, the shamans declared that heaven had chosen Temujin to rule not merely the Mongol tribes but the world. The assembled chiefs knelt before him on the white felt carpet that was the symbol of supreme authority. He was given a new name, a title rather than a personal name that described what he had become and what he was intended to be. Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. He was in his mid-40s. He had been in more or less continuous conflict since he was a child. He had survived abandonment, captivity, kidnapping, betrayal, assassination attempts, military defeats, and the accumulated violence of a world where violence was the primary language of political discourse. He had turned every one of these experiences into knowledge, into the raw material of a system that had taken decades to build, and that was now, for the first time, ready to be directed outward at the world beyond the steppe. The first targets beyond the steppe were the kingdoms that bordered it to the south and east, and the campaigns against them revealed both the extraordinary capability of what Genghis Khan had built and the particular nature of how he used it. The Xi Xia, the Tangut kingdom that controlled the eastern end of the Silk Road trade routes, discovered within a few years of sustained Mongol pressure that the comfortable superiority they had assumed in their relationship with the steppe tribes was based on an assessment of those tribes that was no longer accurate. The Xi Xia became a tributary state, the first of many. The Jin dynasty of northern China was a far more formidable target, and the campaigns against the Jin stretched over more than 2 decades, overlapping with campaigns in other directions and eventually outlasting Genghis Khan himself. The Jin were one of the most powerful states in the world at the time of the Mongol campaigns against them. They had massive walled cities. They had professional armies with substantial numbers, sophisticated equipment, and genuine military experience. They had been managing the threat of steppe raiders for generations and had developed approaches to defense that had worked against every previous version of that threat. The Mongols were a different version. The Jin campaigns exposed both the strengths and the learning capacity of the force Genghis Khan had created. Steppe cavalry tactics, however effective in open terrain, were not adequate against fortified cities. Genghis Khan recognized this immediately and addressed it with the same systematic pragmatism that had characterized his approach to every other problem he had faced. He incorporated captured engineers, Chinese and later other nationalities, into his forces. He studied siege techniques. He experimented with approaches. He was willing to invest time and resources in developing capabilities that his army did not yet have, rather than simply applying the capabilities it did have to problems for which they were insufficient. By the time the Mongol campaigns against northern China had run their course, the army that had started as a steppe cavalry force had become something genuinely unprecedented, a military organization capable of operating effectively across the full range of warfare available in the medieval world, from open-field cavalry engagements to the siege of the most heavily fortified cities. The campaign that shaped the historical memory of Genghis Khan most powerfully, the one whose consequences were so vast that they are still being argued about by historians 8 centuries later, was the campaign against the Khwarazmian Empire. The Khwarazmian Empire in 1218 was a major Islamic power. It controlled the territories of modern Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and surrounding areas. It was wealthy from its position on the Silk Road trade routes. It had a large professional army. Its emperor, Shah Muhammad II, was confident enough in the security of his position that he made a mistake that the evidence suggests he did not fully understand as a mistake until it was far too late to correct. Genghis Khan sent a caravan to the Khwarazmian territories. Merchants with goods, accompanied by a message expressing interest in peaceful trade relations. The governor of the border city of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, who was the Shah's uncle, accused the merchants of being spies and had them executed. When Genghis Khan sent envoys to the Shah demanding justice for this violation, Muhammad had the envoys executed as well. One account says he shaved the heads of the surviving members of the mission to humiliate them before sending them back. The killing of envoys was not simply a diplomatic insult in Genghis Khan's framework. It was a fundamental violation of the principle that made any kind of order possible between powers that existed in conflict with each other. Envoys were inviolable. This was not merely a convention, it was the mechanism that allowed communication to happen across the lines of hostility, and without that mechanism, the only language available was pure force. By killing his envoys, Muhammad had declared that force was the only language he recognized. Genghis Khan prepared his response with characteristic thoroughness. He gathered intelligence about Khwarazmian territory, its cities, its roads, its internal political divisions. He identified the tensions between the Shah and his generals, and between the Shah and his own mother, Turkan Khatun, who controlled significant political and military resources, and whose relationship with her son was, by all accounts, deeply complicated. He assembled his forces. He planned a campaign that would use multiple simultaneous advances to prevent the Khwarazmians from concentrating their defense at any single point. And then he launched it. The speed with which the Khwarazmian Empire collapsed is still, 8 centuries later, difficult to fully comprehend. A state that had existed as a major regional power for decades, that had a large professional army, that had substantial fortifications, simply ceased to function as a coherent political and military entity within a period of 2 or 3 years. The Shah fled before the Mongol advance, never managing to organize effective resistance, dying eventually on a small island in the Caspian Sea as a fugitive in what had recently been his own empire. The cities fell in sequence. Otrar, where the original massacre had taken place, was taken after a siege that ended with Inalchuk, the governor who had killed the merchants, having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment that was specific to the crime of refusing hospitality and killing guests. Bukhara fell. Samarkand, one of the greatest cities of the medieval Islamic world, a center of scholarship and art and commerce that had been accumulating magnificence for centuries, fell in 1220. Merv fell, Nishapur fell, Herat fell. The accounts that survive from these events are still difficult to read. Persian historians who lived through the campaigns or received accounts from survivors describe what they saw in language that moves between precision and a kind of numbed incomprehension. The scale of the destruction challenged the capacity of the people experiencing it to process what they were witnessing, and that challenge is visible in the texts they left behind. Numbers that might be exaggerated, but that, even if substantially reduced, still describe events of staggering magnitude. Cities that had sustained large populations for generations reduced to rubble and bones. Agricultural and hydraulic systems that had been built and maintained over centuries damaged in ways that would take not years but generations to repair. The destruction was not uniform. Cities that surrendered quickly were treated with relative leniency, their populations spared the worst, their commerce allowed to continue under Mongol supervision. Cities that resisted were destroyed comprehensively, the destruction calibrated to function as a permanent demonstration of what resistance cost. Genghis Khan understood clearly that the reputation his campaign established in its early stages would affect the choices made by later targets, and he managed that reputation with the same deliberateness he brought to every other aspect of his campaigns. But the reputation management does not fully account for what happened at Merv, or at Nishapur, or at the other cities where the destruction exceeded what strategic deterrence alone would have required. Something else was operating alongside the military calculation. Something connected to the violation of his envoys. Something connected to the foundational lesson about betrayal and its consequences that had been forming in Temujin since he was 9 years old and watching his clan walk away from his mother and her children. The killing of his envoys had been, in his framework, not a political mistake, but a moral one. It had violated the structure of obligations that made civilized interaction between powers possible. It had declared that those obligations did not apply, that there was no framework within which negotiation and exchange and the normal intercourse of civilizations could function. When someone made that declaration, the response in his framework was to confirm it, to meet the declaration that only force applied with force applied at a scale that made the cost of the declaration permanently clear. He confirmed it comprehensively. The campaign against the Khwarazmian Empire did not end with the fall of the cities. Genghis Khan sent his most capable generals, Jebe and Subutai, on a reconnaissance in force that took them around the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus, into the steppes north of the Black Sea, and into contact with the armies of the Russian princes and the Kipchak Turks. The expedition was nominally a pursuit of the fleeing Shah, but it became something much more significant, a reconnaissance of the Western world that gathered intelligence that would inform the Mongol campaigns against Europe a generation later. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan himself led operations in the east, completing the reduction of the remaining Khwarazmian territories and beginning the process of incorporating them into the administrative structure of the growing empire. The Mongol Empire by this point was already vast enough to present genuine administrative challenges. Governing a territory that stretched from northern China to Central Asia, across landscapes and cultures and languages and religious traditions of extraordinary diversity, required more than the military genius that had created the empire. It required the construction of governing institutions that could function at scale and at distance, that could maintain order and extract resources from territories that Genghis Khan himself would never visit. He built those institutions with the same systematic pragmatism that characterized everything else he did. The Yasa, the law code he promulgated, established rules that applied across the empire regardless of local customs. Religious tolerance was a fundamental principle, not because of any particular philosophical commitment to pluralism, but because the practical management of an empire that contained Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, Taoists, and practitioners of the shamanistic traditions of the steppe required that no single religious tradition be privileged in ways that would create unnecessary conflict with the others. Merchants traveling the trade routes that crossed the empire's territory were given protection and legal standing. The postal system, the yam, that Genghis Khan created allowed messages and goods to move across the empire at speeds that had never previously been achievable, making possible the coherent administration of territories that would otherwise have been simply too far apart to govern from a single center. He continued to appoint people on the basis of ability rather than bloodline, extending to the administration of conquered territories the meritocratic principle that had organized his military from the early days of his rise. People who served well were rewarded, people who failed to serve well were replaced. The origin of the person, their clan, their tribe, their nationality, their religion, was secondary to the question of whether they could do the job and whether they would remain loyal while doing it. This produced an administration that was, by the standards of the era, genuinely effective. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative stability that the Mongol Empire imposed on the vast territories it controlled, allowed trade to flow across distances that had previously been too dangerous or too politically fragmented to traverse safely. Goods moved between China and Europe with a regularity and a volume that had not previously been possible. Ideas moved with the goods. The contact between civilizations that the Mongol trade routes enabled had consequences for the development of both Eastern and Western culture that historians are still tracing. In the later years of his life, between the completion of the Khwarazmian campaign and his death in 1227, Genghis Khan engaged in a kind of reflection that the sources record with a mixture of surprise and careful precision, as if the people around him were not entirely sure what to make of a conqueror who spent time thinking about questions that conquerors do not usually ask. He sought out scholars and religious figures from the various traditions present in his empire. He had extended conversations with a Taoist monk named Chu Chuji, who travelled from China to meet with him at his invitation. The conversations that were recorded from these meetings range across questions of health and longevity and the nature of the soul and the possibility of something persisting beyond the individual life. He was not seeking conversion to any single tradition. He was seeking knowledge, specifically knowledge about the things that he, with all the resources of the largest empire in the world available to him, could not command or control or simply take. He could not command immortality. The body that had crossed the Hindu Kush and survived the steppe winters and absorbed the accumulated damage of decades of warfare was wearing out, and he knew it. The question of what persisted after the body failed was not, for a man who had spent his life building things designed to outlast him, an abstract philosophical question. It was personal. It was urgent. He did not find answers that satisfied him, or if he did, the sources do not record them clearly. What they record is the seeking, which is itself revealing. The man who had spent his entire life imposing his will on everything within his reach had encountered something that could not be imposed upon, and he was trying to understand it. He died in 1227. The circumstances are uncertain in the way that the details of his life often are, filtered through sources with their own interests in how the story was told. The most widely accepted account attributes his death to injuries sustained falling from a horse during a campaign against the Xi Xia, who had attempted to assert their independence while Genghis Khan was occupied in the west. Internal injuries, complicated by fever, in a man in his early 60s whose body had been pushed well past the ordinary limits of human endurance across many decades. His burial place was kept secret in accordance with his instructions. According to tradition, The soldiers who escorted his body killed anyone they encountered on the route, and the soldiers who performed the burial were killed afterward to ensure the location remained unknown. The grave has never been found. The physical Genghis Khan vanished from the earth with a completeness that is almost poetic, leaving behind an empire, a legacy, and a name that 8 centuries of accumulated history have not been able to reduce to something simple enough to dismiss. What do we actually make of him? This is the question that every serious engagement with the history of Genghis Khan eventually reaches, and it is not one that resolves cleanly in any direction that provides comfort. The scale of the destruction he caused is real and should not be softened. Cities that had existed for centuries were reduced to rubble. Agricultural systems built over generations were destroyed in ways that permanently reduced the carrying capacity of large areas of land. Populations that had sustained sophisticated cultures of scholarship and art and commerce were killed in numbers that demographic historians still argue about, but that, even at the most conservative estimates, represent catastrophic human loss. These things happened. They were the direct result of decisions made by a man who had the resources and the authority to make different decisions and chose not to. The scale of what he built is equally real. The Mongol Empire was not simply a vehicle for destruction, it was a functioning political entity that provided genuine benefits to large populations within its territories. The trade routes it protected and enabled carried genuine wealth and genuine exchange. The administrative innovations it introduced were genuinely effective at managing diversity and distance in ways that have influenced governing practices long after the empire itself dissolved. The contact between civilizations that it made possible had consequences for the development of human knowledge and culture that persist to the present. Both of these things are true simultaneously, neither cancels the other out, and the temptation to resolve the contradiction, to decide that one truth is more important than the other, and to let that decision simplify the figure into something more manageable, is exactly the temptation that serious historical engagement requires resisting. He was formed by specific experiences that produced specific values. The abandonment by his clan produced an absolute priority placed on loyalty and an absolute condemnation of betrayal. The captivity produced a visceral understanding of what powerlessness felt like and a determination that it would never happen again. The survival of his family through the years of hardship produced a relentless pragmatism, a willingness to do what was necessary regardless of how it looked or what it cost. These values, applied at the scale of the Steppe Confederation, produced an organization that was coherent, capable, and genuinely better by many measures than what it replaced. People who attached themselves to Temujin's growing confederation generally found that their lives improved, because the protection he provided was real, and the rewards for loyalty were real, and the stability he imposed, however brutal its enforcement, was real. Applied at the scale of empire, the same values produced consequences that the scale transformed into something different in kind, not just in degree. The principle that betrayal must have overwhelming consequences, applied to a city rather than a clan, meant the destruction of a city and the death of its population. The principle that loyalty must be enforced without exception, applied to peoples who had their own loyalties to their own traditions and their own political structures, meant the elimination of those loyalties and those structures by force. The framework was the same. The scale changed the nature of what the framework produced. Here is what I keep returning to when I think about Genghis Khan, and it is this: he was trying to make permanent what can never be made permanent. The security that was taken from him when he was 9 years old and the people who were supposed to stay chose to walk away. He spent his entire life building systems designed to ensure that that experience could not repeat itself. Systems of loyalty so thoroughly enforced, so comprehensively incentivized, and so comprehensively punished when violated, that the calculation which had made his clan's abandonment rational would never again produce that result. He succeeded, to an extent that would have been unimaginable to the boy on the steppe. The world's largest empire, organized around the principle of loyalty to him personally, maintained that loyalty with a consistency that was unprecedented in the history of steppe politics. The people who had attached themselves to him did not walk away because the consequences of walking away were catastrophic and the rewards for staying were real. But the thing he was actually looking for, the feeling of absolute security, the certainty that what had been taken from him would never be taken again, that could not be built out of the materials he was using, not at any scale, not with any army. The security that a 9-year-old boy needs when his community abandons him is not the security that empires provide. It is something smaller and more specific and more human than that. Something that requires a different kind of relationship with a different kind of permanence. He was too consistent to find it through a different means, or too formed by the original wound to see that the wound's lesson, however valid in the context that produced it, was not the only lesson the world had to offer. He built the largest empire in human history. He died without finding what he was looking for. The empire fractured within a few generations. The cities he destroyed stayed destroyed long after the empire that destroyed them had dissolved. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, there is a 9-year-old boy watching the backs of the people who were supposed to stay, learning a lesson that would take a lifetime to apply, and that the application of would change the world in ways that the boy could not have imagined. The wound was real. The response to the wound was, within its own logic, coherent. The consequences of that response at the scale at which he operated were beyond anything that can be adequately described or adequately understood by anyone who did not live through them. But the wound is something that crosses the centuries without losing its clarity. The experience of being abandoned by people who were supposed to stay. The knowledge, absorbed before you have the conceptual framework to process it, that loyalty is conditional and that the conditions can change without warning and without your consent. The determination, formed in the years of survival that followed, that this would never happen again, that you would build something so solid and so comprehensive that the calculation that made the abandonment rational would never again produce that result. This is not ancient. This is not the 12th century Steppe. This is the interior landscape of anyone who has experienced the specific hurt of being left behind by people who were supposed to remain, and who built their subsequent life around ensuring it could not happen again. The scale at which Temujin enacted this project was unique. The project itself was not. What made him in the ways that matter most made you too. Tonight, let the story settle into wherever stories settle in you, not as numbers, not as the catalogue of destruction that is how this story is usually told in the compressed versions that history education tends to produce, not as a moral problem to be solved or a verdict to be rendered, but as a human story about a person who was formed by things he did not choose and who applied the lessons of those things at a scale the original experiences could not have predicted. Let the boy on the step be real to you for a moment, not the Khan, the boy, 9 years old, watching the horizon after the people who were supposed to stay have disappeared over it, learning something in that watching that will take a lifetime to fully understand, and that the lifetime will not fully resolve. Let the achievement speak for itself, because the achievement was genuinely extraordinary and deserves to be acknowledged without the qualification that reduces it to simply a byproduct of violence. The organization was real. The governance was real. The trade and the contact between civilizations and the stability imposed over vast territories were real. Let the cost speak for itself too, because the cost was real and the cities were real and the people were real, and they deserved better than what happened to them, and the fact that the person who decided what happened to them was formed by real experiences that produced a real logic does not change what happened to them. Both truths held together, without resolving them into something simpler than they actually are. And let the man rest. He kept moving for so long. He built so much. He was looking for something that was never going to be found in the direction he was moving, and he moved in that direction with such absolute consistency, such total commitment, that there was never any space to stop and look in a different direction. The fire is low now. The steppe is quiet in the way it gets quiet on the coldest nights, when the wind drops and the stars are very bright and the grass makes no sound at all. He moved through that silence for 60 years. He never quite got to stop. Rest now. Good night.